This is the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety's Disaster Discussions podcast, where we explore the intersection of weather and the built environment.
Welcome to the Disaster Discussions podcast, where we explore the intersection of weather and the built environment. I'm your host, Rachael Penton Gauthier. On January 7th and 8th, 2025, the Palisades and Eaton fires tragically became the latest examples of catastrophic conflagration as Santa Ana winds pushed these wildfires deep into LA County communities. These wildfires ignited just outside of densely populated areas experiencing drought conditions and a volatile wind event that fueled conflagration, uncontrollable structure-to-structure fire spread through connective fuels. Each of these fires quickly consumed thousands of structures, making them California's two of their most destructive fires, only after the 2018 Camp Fire. And before I introduce our guest today, I want to set up the meteorological aspect of these fires. We'll first start with the flash drought scenario. So in the 5 weeks leading up to the fires, a flash drought took hold in the region. So from early December through early January, LA County went from no drought to a severe drought in the area where the fires occurred. LA rainy season is usually November to March with around an inch of rainfall on average, but LAX measured only 3/100ths of an inch of rain from November 1st. And as far as the Santa Ana winds go, the weather pattern consisted of high pressure to the northwest, low pressure to the southwest, creating a tight pressure gradient that initiated strong offshore flow across the California coast. And as those winds flowed through the mountains, the air compressed, warmed, and dried as they descended the terrain, creating those Santa Ana winds. This is a well-forecast event. The National Weather Service in Los Angeles issued a particularly dangerous situation red flag warning on January 7th that detailed the potential for rapid fire spread, extreme fire behavior, and long-range spotting. The extreme wind conditions included the potential for a, quote, life-threatening and destructive windstorm. Gusts reached as high as 100 miles per hour, knocking down trees and fueling the fire spread after it began. This was a textbook worst-case conflagration scenario with the wind vector aligned with the orientation of major roads, which allowed the fire to spread rapidly across the community. 5.8 million people were living in the areas classified as severe drought in LA County, and historically, we know that wildfire-driven suburban conflagrations follow humans, drought, and wind. And of course, we had all three of those line up in this situation. Our guests on Disaster Discussions today, Dr. Murray Morrison, Managing Director of Research, and Steve Hawk, Senior Director for Wildfire. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, Steve, I know you've been on a couple of times. Murray, this is your first time joining our podcast today. So I'll let each of you introduce yourself. Tell us about your role here at IBHS and a little bit about your backgrounds. And Murray, we'll start with you.
Yeah, my role here is to really oversee all the research that IBHS conducts, both here at the lab, but also our field research programs that we do both after during hailstorms, hurricanes, and also wildfires. My background is primarily looking at how wind affects the built environment, both from a structural perspective and how structures are actually damaged.
And how did you end up at IBHS?
So I started my journey at IBHS back in 2010, just after the facility opened, as actually a postdoc, looking at the actual wind field in our facility. And really characterizing it and how we actually reproduce the real world winds you see in the real world here in a laboratory setting.
And Steve, you are resident wildfire expert here at IBHS, and you have a background in the fire service out in California. And introduce yourself to our guest today and tell us how you made your way to IBHS.
Yeah, thank you. So I've been with IBHS for 2 years now, and I touch on all things related to wildfire that IBHS does. So as Murray mentioned, the research, I help with that a little bit. I also help with the post-fire deployments that we do, as well as managing some of the aspects of the Wildfire Prepared Home program and development of the Wildfire Prepared Neighborhood program. And my background, as you mentioned, is in the California Fire Service, where I worked for CAL FIRE for over 30 years, the first 24 years in the field from firefighter to battalion chief, responding to emergencies of all types, including a lot of wildland fires. And then the last 6+ years, I transitioned to work in the office of the state fire marshal within CAL FIRE, where I worked in directly overseeing some of the programs related to parcel level and community preparedness, like defensible space and home hardening, damage inspection, and then worked my way up to the point when I retired as assistant deputy director, overseeing all the programs related to property and community preparedness for wildfire.
So I know this is obviously not your first go around with wildfire. You worked on the Camp Fire, is that correct? Or you were involved a bit in some of the more recent notorious conflagrations in California?
Yes, I was deployed to the Camp Fire as well as the Tubbs Fire and damage inspection capacity. I recall being on the Tubbs Fire, where at the time it was the most destructive wildfire in California history, thinking that, or maybe being optimistic that we wouldn't see a more destructive wildfire, but it wasn't a little over a year later that the Camp Fire came along and really just significantly destroyed a lot more structures and virtually the town of Paradise.
And here we are, 2025. We started off the year with not one, but two simultaneous devastating conflagrations. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So IBHS, we've conducted several post-damage investigations of wildfire conflagrations in the past. One of our most recent deployments was in Lahaina, Hawaii, back in November 2023. And we were able to get teams out to California pretty quickly after these LA County wildfires. Within just about a week of the start of the fires, they were still ongoing as we began making our way out there. And I want to talk a little bit about how we were able to do this, kind of set up our deployment for you. So this was thanks in part to our strong partnership with CAL FIRE. And Steve, or you're better known as Chief Hawks out there, you're a big part of this partnership. Kind of tell us about this partnership with CAL FIRE and really how this allowed us to be able to get out there pretty quickly after these LA County fires.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I mentioned, I had a career with CAL FIRE. And part of that was in the fire marshal's office, where I managed and then oversaw the CAL FIRE damage inspection program. So I was able to quickly reach out to Chiefs Berlant and Bigelow and work with them to arrange for our deployment to both fires and kind of embed with the damage inspection process that was occurring at each incident. But our relationship with CAL FIRE, of course, is much more than that. IBHS really brings the scientific background where through our research that Murray leads and then our post-fire analysis like we did here on the Eaton and Palisades fires, we are able to determine the vulnerabilities with structures and make meaningful recommendations on how to mitigate those vulnerabilities. And entities like CAL FIRE then take that information and are able to advance codes. In California's case, the California Building Code Chapter 7A and defensible space codes, as well as make improvements to their programs that they administer throughout the state of California, and then really target the funding that they have available to implement those programs on the ground. And so another example of that is we are working very closely with CAL FIRE on a structure separation experiment to better understand the relationship of structure to structure fire spread. And CAL FIRE is playing a critical role in that, providing some much needed funding to assist with that. And from that, we'll be able to provide guidance back to California on how they can make improvements to the California Building Code Chapter 7A. So it's really a relationship to take a coin from the sports world, where we are much stronger together.
Yeah, they were certainly a big help. I was on the deployment as well, and I learned a lot from all of our guides that kind of guided us from one place to the other. I think they learned a few things from us as well. So certainly a great partnership. And before we get into the weeds of the deployment, I actually just want to give them all a shout out. Chiefs Berlant and Bigelow. And then on the Eaton Fire, we had Chiefs Pivaroff, Vargas, Masuko, and Damon assisting us, as well as Captains Arnold and Pimlod. And then we also headed over to the Palisades Fire, where we did surveys as well. Big help there. Chief McCulley, Potke, Lindo, Merck, Northup, Galvez, Wysop, and of course, course, the CAL FIRE UAS teams, and many more. So we certainly could not have done this deployment without all of their help. So a huge thank you to them. Now, we were able to coordinate access to both the Eaton Fire and the Palisades Fire perimeters, which were still very much closed off to the world. In fact, it was really eerie in some spots, kind of a end of the world type feeling. I remember being in a neighborhood one day and it was absolutely deserted. I was the only one there waiting on our drone guy to get back and help us. So really, these were completely closed down. A lot of these areas had not been repopulated yet. So for the most part, the only people who had access to the areas were the first responders, along with the CAL FIRE DENS teams, who were conducting damage inspections on all the structures within the fire perimeter. There were a few utility crews who were beginning restoration efforts in some areas, especially over in the Eaton Fire area. So, Steve, tell us a little bit about more about these DENS crews. What are these teams doing as they head into this fire perimeter immediately after these events?
So DENS stands for damage inspection, and it's deployed on incidents like this, where we have structures damaged and destroyed. And so teams are deployed to the incident to categorize structures greater than 120 square feet. And they categorize them by the type of structure it is, the amount of damage that it has received based on FEMA's damage categories, the location of these structures, and then a number of attributes about each structure related to the exterior building materials and other things on the property, like accessory structures, ADUs, fences, decks, and so forth. They are led by damage inspection managers, and the teams of two are sent out into the field, and they have a certain geographic area of the incident that they're responsible for, gathering the data for each structure that meets that 120 square foot category or larger. And they conduct a really methodical search, if you will, of that area to ensure that they don't miss any structures. And the data that they then gather goes through a very rigorous quality assurance and quality control process back at the incident base. And then once the data is validated and accurate, then it can be used for a number of purposes. And initially, that's just really to let everyone know what's happening at the incident, provide information about the number of structures impacted and so forth. But some other initial users of the data are homeowners, as they really want to start the claims process if they've had a loss or damage to their structure. Insurers can use that to validate that amount of damage as well. And then other organizations like Cal OES, FEMA, American Red Cross, local building officials, and others can use that information to help with the recovery process. And so I'd really like to say a big hat tip here to CAL FIRE Incident Management Team 2 and 3 for really welcoming us into their damage inspection process.
Yeah, it was very interesting to see that process play out. Very important. I mean, I know I had a friend whose mother's home is located in the Palisades fire, and it was not repopulated yet, her neighborhood. She had no idea if her house was still standing, and I was able to go to that public-facing dashboard, access that data, and let her know that her home was actually completely fine. So, but unfortunately, we know in this situation, a lot of homeowners were able to access this data to see maybe some of the first photos of their damaged homes before being back into the neighborhood. So it serves multiple purposes, very important purposes though, all around. So I want to talk about our deployment logistics. And we've done some recent deployments. I mentioned Lahaina. We've been to Paradise as well. So Murray, can you kind of compare the logistics of this particular deployment to what teams dealt with in gaining access for some of our past deployments? I know Lahaina was a bit of a challenge to gain access, and each one is different. So kind of compare this deployment in LA County to some of our previous ones here at IBHS.
Yeah, sure. As you said, getting access to the affected region is a critical aspect of our deployment. So it's the number one thing, particularly with a lot of our research staff based here on the East Coast. It's a long way for us to go and fly out there just to go there and realize that we can't get into the affected areas to actually access what we're going to look at. And I think for this particular fire, we thanks to Steve and some other IBHS members that are based in California, we had a much more local presence on the ground, which helped facilitate some of that. Whereas in the previous fires, so for example, Lahaina, that's a much even further place to go. From where we are near Charlotte, North Carolina, I joke that I can be in Europe much faster and much easier than I can be in Hawaii. So there's a lot of distance logistics for us shipping our equipment. But as Steve alluded earlier, really the support of CAL FIRE really made the logistics of this particular deployment a lot easier for us to manage and a lot less uncertainty in terms of our planning going forward. Sometimes we do these deployments, we make the best decisions, but we are somewhat rolling the dice in terms of traveling out there and whether we're going to be able to secure access or not. But I think this is actually one of the earliest, in terms of wildfire, the earliest relative to the fire that we've been able to secure access and assess the damage after the fires occurred.
Yeah, we pretty much immediately began planning this deployment. I know within about a week or so the fire started, we already had a lot in motion. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I think from the time the fires happened to the time that we actually made the decision to kind of deploy our first team to the area was probably a matter of 3 days. I think it is kind of that decision-making timeline. I think that's much, much, much faster than we've done for any of the other wildfire deployments or even some of the post-hurricane damage assessments. I don't think we've ever actually made that decision to book travel and head to that zone within 3 days of the event.
Yeah, everyone was really able to mobilize really quickly. And I want to start with the Eaton Fire. This is where our post-damage investigation began. So our first deployment team consisting of Murray and Steve, and then also Faraz and Evan, two of our wildfire researchers. You guys all arrived in LA on Sunday the 12th. And then we had team two, a couple more of our researchers, Ali and Malad, Mark from our wildfire prepared program, and myself. We arrived on Tuesday. And you guys kind of started scoping out some things, kind of scouting for locations that we may want to survey. And then we began that deployment on the Eaton Fire. So we started each morning with a briefing around 7 a.m. We met at the Rose Bowl each morning, which served as the incident base for the Eaton Fire. This was an absolutely massive operation. I was so surprised when we pulled into the Rose Bowl parking lot. It was like a miniature city, just trailers full of places to sleep, places to eat, medical trailers. It's really like a miniature city that they're able to put up there. So Steve, talk about CAL FIRE's ability to respond to these large-scale wildfire events. Talk about this incident base. Really, they seem quite prepared and as if they've done this quite a few times in the past.
Yes, it is truly amazing. I spent 13 years on CAL FIRE incident management teams, or IMTs as they're generally referred to, and it still amazes me how quickly that the city, as you mentioned, it can be assembled and really support the needs of the incident. So CAL FIRE has 6 incident management teams, and they're all hazard teams. So although they primarily respond to wildland fires, they also have responded to other events as they're needed. And some of those have been flood events, debris flows after the Thomas Fire and community of Montecito, COVID-19, pandemic, the exotic Newcastle disease, which affects chickens. So they can really quickly deploy. They're made up of a group of individuals that are subject matter experts within their assigned functional spot or position on the incident management team. And they get to know each other. They worked with each other many times on various incidents. So they really know what each other's capabilities are and what to expect from each other. And so they're able to quickly hit the ground running. And in fact, when they're on call, within 1 hour of being activated or called to the incident, they have to be able to respond. And so once they get to the incident, they're able to really build that small city out and provide all the needs of the resources that are assigned and the people, as you mentioned, from sleeping areas to feeding them and logistically supporting them. So it's just truly incredible at what they can assemble in a short period of time. And then on the back end, once the incident begins to de-escalate, they're able to quickly reverse that and make the city go away in a short period of time. So truly amazing what the CAL FIRE incident management teams can do.
It was definitely like a well-oiled machine. Well, some background on the Eaton Fire. It actually began after the Palisades fire was already underway on the evening of Tuesday, January 7th, just after 6 p.m. local time. And the fire began in the wildland urban interface around Eaton Canyon and first spread to some of the homes near the intersection of Altadena Drive and Midwick Drive. At the time the fire started, the strongest Santa Ana winds were occurring with peak gusts of about 85 miles per hour. By the following morning, the fire began spreading into the Las Flores Canyon and East Loma Alta Drive, where tighter spacing of homes and connective fuels allowed the fire to become a conflagration that spread throughout the day. Unfortunately, air operations were grounded most of this day due to the high winds. We saw the fire spread throughout Altadena neighborhoods and the main commercial corridor, where Aldi, Bank of America, and many other businesses were burned. This was an interesting event in that we were able to watch it play out live on news coverage pretty much from beginning to end. I know a lot of the buildings that I was watching burn down live on television. We then later saw in person and were able to survey. So pretty unique event in that aspect. But I want to talk a little bit about the building stock, the building codes in this area. Murray, tell me about some of the characteristics of the community where the Eaton Fire occurred.
Yeah, sure. So in the area that the Eaton Fire impacted, a lot of that construction was dense suburban construction that was built predominantly in the 1950s. There was some infill with some newer structures that were built, but really the predominant amount of all the structures really was built prior to 2008, and that's significant because that's where the California Building Code, or Chapter 7A, really started to be enforced, or requiring new construction to comply with Chapter 7A in the very high severity regions of the region. And so most of that construction wasn't built to the newer modern building codes within California.
And in comparison to the homes, we saw a lot of the homes in Palisades, very upscale communities. In the Altadena, Pasadena community, which is where the Eaton Fire occurred, this was more of a standard, more of a middle-class neighborhood, and we could really see a big difference in the homes between these two fires. So when we were deciding where to start with our survey, talk about why we chose Eaton to start there.
Yeah, it's as you said, we're looking at mitigation for the most common types of structures that we have in America, in which it's the normal suburban types of communities where most of the people go and live, and that's what we're most interested in, how fires conflagrate, because it's the most common types of structures, and it's what are those elements and what are those structural features that matter, right? So those are the most common features, and those are transferable into most neighborhoods in America, in both California and beyond.
Okay, so definitely more of a standard type neighborhood than in comparison to a lot of the larger homes that we saw in Palisades that were on really pretty large lots as well. So after the morning briefing for the Eaton Fire, we then split up into 3 teams. Typically, we went into neighborhoods within that fire perimeter to start those ground surveys. And we typically were on foot, walking from house to house, covering 1 or 2 streets at a time. And while carrying out the surveys, we were looking for a certain level of damage at the parcel level. So first, I want to say, when we say the parcel level, we're talking about a person's home, the surrounding property, more or less their lot space. We didn't survey houses that were total losses. There were many that were burned completely to the ground, but we were looking for homes that were more partially damaged. Talk about why this is, Steve.
Absolutely. So when you have a home that's totally lost, we really can't determine the failure points with the home. So was it something combustible in zone the first 5 feet that surrounds the house, where embers ignited that and broke a window and led to the structure loss? Was it a neighbor's home that was burning that was in close proximity that ignited the side of the house or underneath the eaves? So it's really hard to recreate what led to the loss of the structure. So that's why we really hone in on the structures that are damaged, and we can see where the damage occurred on the structure and have a much better chance of determining where it ignited, maybe what ignited it, and also what was the house made out of, the exterior building materials and so forth, and what surrounds that house. So that predisposes it to the wildland fire. And the reason we don't know what actually happens on all of these structures is we don't know the exposure per se, as how much flames, radiant heat, direct flame contact did that home experience. And as we know, there's very extreme variability as the fire burns through a community from even one property to the next, and across the neighborhood as well. So it's really hard to know also when a home was defended by firefighters. Sometimes they leave evidence of that by putting a hole in the roof of a home that's has ignited to ventilate that structure, or they may leave one of their fire hoses on the property. But sometimes it's not that easy to determine if the house was defended. So all these things go into determining the outcome of a structure.
Yeah, very forensic nature. Each individual parcel was kind of its own little cold case that we kind of had to look for evidence to figure out how this fire started. I know you guys, as we did come across homeowners and things, we were asking for things like surveillance video and footage to kind of help piece that together, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That really helps us hone in on where the damage and what may have led to that. If we can see a picture, of course, the video is much better. Or firefighters, the homeowner, if they made the decision to stay behind, can provide some valuable insights for us.
And Murray, what data points are we collecting at each of these houses, and how does what we collect differ from the information that the DINS teams are collecting?
Yeah, so I think the information we're taking is very similar than the DINS team. I think that the difference is just a matter of scale. We're getting into a lot more detail than the DINS team is going to do that, and I think it's kind of really the goals of this particular assessment, right? The DINS teams are surveying tens of thousands of structures in these cases. What we're focusing on, as Steve said, is the undamaged homes, and so we're surveying in the hundreds of homes, but we're doing it almost with a fine-tooth comb. We're looking at all kinds of different, like what was the size of the mesh that was on different types of vents, what was the window material, what was the framing material of the window, and then the other aspect, in addition to all these really, really small, detailed building details, is also the connective fuels, the vegetation fuels, and the fences around the parcel. So we're really looking at the parcel as a whole, both all the building features, but also all that vegetation and how far it was and what the density was at a lot of different scales.
And the Eaton Fire was still underway while we were on this deployment, but we were able to gain aerial access to fly our drone over the same home. So we survey these on the ground, and then we were able to fly above a lot of these same homes to capture that aerial imagery. So how will our researchers use the drone imagery that we were able to gather, and have we ever been able to capture imagery like this so soon after a fire has occurred? Again, some neighborhoods, some homeowners were back starting to begin some small repairs, but some of the neighborhoods were still completely untouched. You could tell people had dropped everything and just evacuated, and it was kind of frozen in time. So what will we be able to get from this drone imagery?
Yeah, so like I just said, in on the ground, we're looking at these minute details, right? The types of events. I think the drone footage really allows us to look at that bigger picture, and most importantly, the connective fuels or different features we can't see to the ground. So from the air, you get a much better sense of scale of the connective fuels that you won't have from the ground. And so you're able to assess whether there was that fuel pathway from, say, a destroyed structure to that structure and how that might have progressed, and to measure those distances. The other things is from the ground, you often can't see the roof, right? We're not climbing on ladders up onto the roof. Structures, roofs are really complex. And so it's not always possible to see all the different types of vents or all the different types of openings from the ground. And so that aerial imagery can get at some of the things that we miss from a ground survey. So it's a really critical tool in that. And I think by combining it with a very detailed ground survey and the aerial, we get a much fuller picture that one or the other tool wouldn't give us as a whole.
Yeah, I would say also, I noticed a lot of, interesting terrain surrounding some of the houses, a lot of escarpments and washes and different areas that we really didn't kind of see the whole picture until we got the drone up. I thought that was kind of unique.
Yeah, absolutely. There's oftentimes you can't see things from there just because of your access to those particular properties. And so by getting the drone up, you can see things from a different angle that might change your opinion on what things had progressed that you wouldn't have seen otherwise.
All right, well, as we made our way through these neighborhoods, we observed many individual homes that were total losses. Often they were standing right next to homes that sometimes had little to even no damage. Then in other areas, there were places where we saw maybe several homes or even entire streets and blocks that were total losses. So Murray, talk about these more discrete, likely ember-driven spot fires versus some of those neighborhoods where the streaks of conflagration were really evident. Kind of talk about the difference in those two things.
Yeah, we definitely saw a really kind of that patchy kind of structures that survived in that case. And we often talk about the ember a fair bit, and it absolutely creates these fires. It can ignite different vegetative fuels or ignite structures directly, right? And so if there's not a connective fuel pathway, it's just a spot fire due to those embers. The risk or the challenge or the danger comes in is those embers ignite materials that then ignite structures. And now you have a burning structure burning right next to another one. And in a lot of cases, you have that then igniting the next house and then the next house and the next house. And then you get that suburban conflagration really started by those spot fires. Now, if you are able to break that chain of events, you can prevent that spot fire from turning into those streaks.
Yes, I mean, I remember a few, I know we were in a cul-de-sac at one point and, you'd think maybe the whole cul-de-sac would burn down, but in a lot of cases, there was just one home that burned down, the rest survived. So that would be an example of where an ember maybe landed on the roof, caught the home on fire. And as you mentioned, there wasn't connective fuel to spread it to the neighbors next door. So the rest of the home survived. But then in other instances, that chain of fire just kept going and going as the fire spread through vegetation and other things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And oftentimes there are things as like the road can actually stop that chain of conflagration as well.
Yeah, fuel breaks. All right. So sometimes we saw some things that were a little confusing to us. Sometimes there were homes that seemed to have everything wrong with them, yet they were unburned. Then there were others that had some wildfire resilient features, and maybe they did receive some damage. So is there any degree of randomness to the damage, or can we explain all of these homes and why they were or were not burned?
Yeah, so as a scientist, I like to think that everything is explainable, and I think that's largely true. But I think there is a lot of degree of that. What you said there is that some homes looked like they had everything wrong and didn't burn, and other homes looked like they did a pretty good job and then still had damage or were destroyed. And I think that just points to all the different ways that fires or these kind of conflagration events can be a danger to a structure. And it really starts to become almost an all or nothing kind of mitigation strategy, is that there's so many different ways that conflagration can occur, whether it's the embers, the radiant heat, the direct flame contact, that can all come into play. What wind direction the wind's coming from. Is your structure elevated or recessed from the structure next to it? Do you have a stone wall next to your house? All of those factors can come into play that can really make the difference between whether your structure it catches on fire and is lost, or whether essentially you're spared and not and hasn't or caught on fire. So I think those factors really, and they can come in a sort of feel like they're random kind of thing, and they in some ways they are, but all those factors can come into play.
Yeah, again, that's where that really close forensic type of investigation comes in. I mean, there were homes that I remember seeing, seemed okay, but then maybe they had a non-combustible fence, but then the gate was made out of wood. So just that one small, minute detail could, kind of stop that chain from being broken.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Rachel, if I could add to that, I think there's a couple misconceptions about wildfire out there that, wildfire just burns as one big flaming front, burning everything in its path, when in reality, that's not the case. Of course, there is a flaming front that does burn things that are in its path, but it produces a lot of embers that flow out in front of the main fire. And when they fall to the ground, they can ignite additional fires called spot fires. And those fires can then develop into new fires really themselves and merge together, and then also produce more embers to produce that are lofted out in front, creating additional fires. So it's a very complex environment. That's why it kind of seems so random at times. And then the second misconception is that it's really a wildfire once that's burning in the built environment or the neighborhood. But once it really enters into that neighborhood environment, it stops being a wildfire and it really becomes more of an urban fire, or that could lead to an urban conflagration, burning urban fuels. And that's everything that is ignitable, including homes and outbuildings, fences, sheds, vehicles, and so forth. So we still have a wildfire burning out in your traditional wildland areas, but we also have an urban fire burning within the neighborhoods.
Yeah, I saw a really good analogy that they said, often people think of a wildfire like a tsunami. You think of the wave slowly progressing in one large wave, but that is not the case at all. You certainly have your fire front, which would maybe be the tsunami wave, but we know that 90% of ignitions come from wind-driven embers, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So it's certainly complex, like you mentioned, Steve. And Steve, I want to talk about those terrain differences that you mentioned, Murray. So we could be standing on one parcel or one lot, and you could often look down in elevation down onto the parcel next door. So Steve, I think you mentioned that you had some theories on how this maybe could have impacted damage from one property to the next.
Yes. So fire naturally, without wind, wants to burn straight up. When you add wind to it, it can tilt the flames and the heat over and make it travel in the direction the wind is flowing. So when you have a structure at a higher elevation that is on fire, and even under a strong wind that's tilting the flames towards the structure that's downhill or downwind from that structure that's on fire, most of the flames, because of that difference in elevation, will go up over top of that structure that's downhill. And because of that lower structure can receive a lower amount of heat and flames from that structure that's burning uphill from it. Now, if you put those two structures at the same elevation, that structure that is downwind from the one that's burning is going to receive a much higher exposure to those flames and radiant heat. And then conversely, if you have the lower house, the lower elevation house on fire, and one above, naturally the heat wants to go up and would expose that house that's uphill with greater heat and flames. But if the wind is blowing, as in this example, it could tilt those flames and heat away and push it away from the uphill house, helping to kind of protect it, if you will.
This has been Disaster Discussions, Observations in LA, How the Eaton and Palisades Conflagrations Became Two of California's Worst, Part 1. In Part 2, we continue our discussion to include the Palisades Fire, and we dive into observations and conclusions from this deployment.
Thanks for listening to the Disaster Discussions podcast. Join us next month for a new episode. For more on IBHS's ongoing research efforts, visit ibhs.org.